So we're talking about philosophers and thinkers of the late 19th and early 20th centuries who were important to society. And we mentioned Henry David Thoreau last time, and we're shifting from Thoreau to another interesting character, Friedrich Nietzsche. That mustache aside, he's an entertaining guy to say the least. And Nietzsche's going to change the way that people think for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is what he called the critique of God. In particular, Friedrich Nietzsche was a devout atheist. He did not believe that God exists, but he was a different kind of atheist. Nietzsche is a guy who kind of wished that God was real because he thought, believe it or not, religion and God were important to an extent. And he's an atheist, but we're going to see in a second why he wants there to be a God. He's also known for what he called at the time perspectivism, and we would probably call this moral relativism. And here's where things get tricky. He said, listen, if there is no God, that's a problem. Because he said the ideas of right and wrong in society and in most of the world, especially in Europe and the United States, were based on the idea that certain things are right or wrong because God says they are. And if God says they are, you can't argue with that. But Nietzsche says, listen, since he didn't believe in God, he said right and wrong are a matter of perspective. We call that moral relativism. What's right to someone may be wrong to someone else, right? And so he says, listen, your morals and values are dependent upon your society and where you're born or where you're raised. And so he looked at different things culturally and said some things that maybe Africans do, Europeans would look at and be disgusted, and vice versa. And he said, listen, that's a problem for society. He said, if there is no God and right and wrong just depends on your perspective, it's just a matter of perspective, then nobody could ever claim that they were indeed right or wrong. Ultimately, we would all just be victims of circumstance. Your idea of right and wrong is no better than anyone else's. And if your idea of right and wrong is no better than anyone else's, then you can never really hold people accountable. And that's going to be a big deal later on when the Nazis come to power in the 1930s and 1940s, because the rest of the world is going to look at the Nazis and say, what you're doing is indeed wrong. But Friedrich Nietzsche says, listen, if there's no God, then it's all just a matter of perspective. And no perspective is better than the other. And this really caused a problem for Nietzsche. He was not thrilled about coming to this particular conclusion. And so he says, if there's no God, and everything's just a matter of perspective, then he says, my third bullet point here is going to be more important. He believed human beings had a will to power, okay? And a will to power simply means that human beings are going to be driven by their desire to have power over other people. That the only way that you could really enjoy life or be pleased with life is if it's at the expense of other people. So he would look at a situation, say, like imperialism, and say, listen, ultimately, if Europeans have the ability to exploit African nations or weaker Asian countries, then that's just too bad for them. They should have been tougher to deal with it. The will to power, that human beings, the only thing that would really make them happy deep down is that they want power. And I think there's some truth to that. Friedrich Nietzsche says, I'm not really thrilled about this conclusion, but this is the way that humans are. And if you look at human history, there's always somewhat of that will to power, that one society is trying to dominate or control other societies or other civilizations. All right? So Friedrich Nietzsche, his critique of God and his ideas about atheism were something that were not exactly a popular take at the time. You have to remember that Europe and the United States are largely Christian. And ultimately, for him to come out and be an atheist and to make this critique of God was a big deal. And he's going to start, along with some other thinkers and philosophers, to make people start questioning what they believe and why they believe it. That is going to be something that still hasn't been resolved. Nietzsche really thought religion would go away, but we've seen in the 130, 140 years since then that it hasn't. And I'm not saying what you have to believe or don't have to believe, but Nietzsche was an interesting character, and he was concerned about where this would lead society. And he hoped that human beings would be able to come together and agree upon a set of rules and principles. and we haven't been able to do that. Okay, another major thinker at the time, we want to talk very briefly about Sigmund Freud. You've probably heard of Freud, and he has some different thoughts about human beings and what really drives them. Whereas Nietzsche thought about something in terms of the pleasure principle, Nietzsche thought about the will to power. Sigmund Freud says human beings aren't primarily out trying to get power, they're trying to get pleasure. They're just trying to please themselves. And he came up with a theory, and you don't have to remember these three things, but he said there's three parts to the human psyche, okay? The ego, the superego, and the id. And you can read these right here. But he says, within your brain, within your subconscious, you have different impulses at the conscious and unconscious level and somewhere in between. And this was a big deal for him. He's kind of in direct conflict with what Nietzsche's saying. He's like, human beings really care more than anything about seeking some type of gratification, right? Now, Freud also known for psychotherapy. And this is a big contribution to the world as well because it changes the way that we deal with mental health. To give you an idea, psychotherapy comes from two Greek words. The psych part comes from the Greek word for soul, and therapy means healing. So literally, it means soul healing. And the idea was, Sigmund Freud said, listen, you don't have to medicate people who have various mental illnesses or mental ailments. Psychotherapy is about talking out your problems. He really is the guy who's behind the drive for psychotherapy. And ultimately, he changes the way that people approach mental illness. Up until Freud's experimentation with psychotherapy, people oftentimes were committed or given various medications that weren't really a help. And Freud changes society for the better in that regard. And now that's what we largely encourage. A lot of problems can simply be talked out with a therapist. When you think of psychotherapy, think of like the classic psychologist sitting down with a patient who's lying on a couch just telling about their problems.